AJC Central Europe, and it's a great honor and privilege to have you all here for our debate, Is there a future for Polish-Jewish relations? I would very much appreciate if you could mute your phones. Let me greet everybody very warmly. First and foremost, representatives of the Polish government and members of the diplomatic corps. We have with us today Ambassador of Israel, Mr. Yakov Livne. We have the Ambassador of Australia, Lloyd Broderick. We have former Polish ambassadors to Israel, Jacek Chodorowicz and Maciej Kozłowski, and former Polish ambassador to the US, Ryszard Schnepf. Other members of the diplomatic corps, distinguished guests, it's an honor to have you here. You couldn't imagine there would be a better time to talk about Polish-Jewish relations. Anytime we're going through difficulties is a good time to talk, and we have seen over the last 4 years or so situations in which the natural reaction would be and was, oi, how do we fix that? And then several months pass, there is no fixing to the problem, there is yet another chapter. There is more that we are thinking about how to deal with that, how to handle. And just recently we saw yet another instance of that situation in which many of us have been busy thinking how to fix things, and there's more to think about. So it's probably one of those times when really analyzing the situation and trying to think out of the box. We certainly have had, many of us, many ideas. Some of them have been tested, some of them not, but it's probably about thinking out of the box. And I'm really happy that my boss, AJC Chief Executive Officer David Harris, is with us today. You definitely saw his impressive bio in the invitation letters. Let me just say that he has a very strong mandate to talk about Polish-Jewish relations in his capacity as the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Jewish people, as he was famously labeled by the late Shimon Peres. And David will be in conversation with Ewa Junczyk-Ziomecka, President of the Jan Karski Educational Foundation, formerly Undersecretary and Secretary of State in the Chancellery of the President of Poland under President Kaczynski, and also former Polish Consul General in New York. Ewa, the floor is yours.
Fantastycznie. Dzień dobry Państwu. Good morning, yes, good morning. It's a real pleasure, David, to be again with you here and with all of you, the people that were involved for years in the Polish-Jewish dialogue, and I appreciate very much for your work that you've done, and thank you for coming today. David, let me start with expressing my deepest gratitude for honoring Jan Karski by AJC and naming after his name the AJC Awards. Thank you very much. And Jan Karski, who is a symbol of understanding and empathy of Poles and Jews, I hope our conversation will be in the spirit of Jan Karski's values. I strongly believe in it. And let me start from the beginning. When Poland was in transition, and you personally and American Jewish Committee was the first major Jewish American organization who came to Poland. Why you did this? What was the reason?
Dzień dobry Państwo. Good morning to everyone. And I have to say at the beginning, it's not just because I want to make sure that Ewa does not ask me difficult questions, though that's part of my reasoning. But I'm so happy to be here together with Ewa, who's been a friend for many years.
Thank you.
And I'm happy to switch places because Ewa's sitting under the AJC banner, and I'm sitting under the Jan Karski banner, and as someone who knew Jan Karski from 1985 until his death in 2000, he is my personal hero. So any proximity to Jan Karski for me is something very special. So let me begin by saying that I'm not a masochist, because generally speaking, only a masochist would enter into this discussion. I say this after more than 40 years of what began as a very naive journey, simply believing that there were several things that tied Poland and the Jewish people together, and AJC was the pioneer in the United States in exploring this, and I wanted to participate. And my naivete was shattered, Eva, within about 15 minutes. The first meeting I attended with, actually with Jan Karski, with Jan Novak, with Edward Moskal, and others, and the AJC side was in Chicago. And it began very pleasantly discussing the weather and the sports results from the previous days and whatever personal connections there were. And then 15 minutes later, I witnessed this pleasant conversation descend into a verbal war. And 41 years later, here we are. And the verbal war is not yet over. And the verbal war, as everyone in this room knows extremely well, is not about the present, it's about the past. It's a set of competing narratives. And we'll get to that, I'm sure, Eva, but what attracted me in the beginning was I had a very sort of simple moral equation. If you were on the right side of World War II history, and you were on the wrong side of Soviet occupation, then for me, you were a very friendly country. It was that simple. My own family, my parents, had experienced both Soviet communism and then Nazi fascism. So that was that. And when you add to that, Eva, the arrival of John Paul II to the Vatican, on top of which the events in the shipyards of Gdansk, to me, Poland was a very friendly country. And that's why I very enthusiastically, energetically, and naively walked onto the stage and said, I want to join Team Polish-Jewish Relations. And as I said, that was 41 years ago. And if we were in a swimming pool, you would see the scars that are still not healed from those 41 years. Do I think it was worth it? Absolutely. Do I think it's a lost cause? Absolutely not. But I realize it's far more complicated than I imagined in those early days.
But David, you've spoken about the Polish-Jewish...
I think you should.
I'm sorry. Czy Państwo mnie słyszą?
No, I think we
Dobrze.
should.
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry. But David, you've spoken about the Polish-Jewish relation as a minefield, and yet you persist for those last 30 or over 30 years. Why?
Maybe in the end I am a masochist. Having said I'm not. No, I do, Eva, and again, I know many of you in the room, you know me, I'm not a historian, and I know these discussions can quickly go down to very specific moments in time and various mutual accusations. I'm not a historian, and I don't pretend to be. I simply begin with the impulse, Eva, which has never left me. We were both on the right side of history. And whatever the differences may be, ultimately, I continue to believe, Eva, that what should unite us is far more powerful than what divides us. And to go to 2022 for a moment, there's probably one person more than anyone else on the planet who welcomes these frictions and tensions. And his name is known to you. Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. So people like Putin will welcome and seek to exploit these divisions. I'm not really sure who else stands to benefit from these ongoing tensions. And I'm no longer naive about the sources of the tension, but I do believe that there are solutions, pathways forward, if the bridge builders in both communities are stronger than the arsonists in both communities. And there are arsonists or extremists in both communities. But there are also bridge builders on both sides. They're in this room. I've met hundreds over the years through our exchange program with Forum for Dialogue, and I want to give a shout out to Forum for Dialogue and its leadership who are here, many of its alumni. There are many in the Polish government over the years that have been bridge builders, just as there are many in Israel, and some, I won't say many, necessarily in the American Jewish community. I count myself one of them. I don't think it's lost, Eva.
David, I don't know if you remember, I met you for the first time in 2004 for that was the opening of the memorial at the former Nazi German death camp in Bełżec. By the way, it is worth recalling here that the joint commemoration of some 500,000 Polish citizens of Jewish nationality was the result of unprecedented cooperation between the AJC and the Polish authorities. The question is about the history, because we wanted to talk about the future, but what history? What is the place for the history that are glued to the future? That we cannot talk about the future without the past. Do you agree with this?
I do, and allow me. I'm not a historian. I'm not a psychoanalyst, but I do think this relationship needs psychoanalysis. It's not just a debate of historians, though it is. And so allow me my very amateurish, and I apologize in advance, my very amateurish understanding. We have here two peoples who are in some ways very similar. I don't really understand Sigmund Freud, but I'm very attracted to one of the titles of his essays, which is The Narcissism of Small Differences. You have a Polish people who have a martyred sense of self. We are perhaps the Christ among the nations. The first 5 words of the Polish national anthem. We have not yet vanished or disappeared, I think Richard is the rough translation in English. I understand that the Ukrainians have a similar opening, but who else on the planet could understand those 5 words better than the Jews? You disappeared from the world map as a state for 123 years, I believe, from 1795 to 1918. We disappeared from the world map from the year 70 in the Common Era until the rebirth of Israel in 1948. Allow me to say, you know the word chutzpah. Maybe it's chutzpah. I believe I understand you. I believe I understand your sense of vulnerability, the very real danger, the effort to maintain a spirit when there was no state, and a sense of nation when there was no land that was your own sovereign land. I identify with it totally, not because I come from Poland. I'm one of those rare Ashkenazi Jews who doesn't come from Poland. There's something wrong in my family. Can't quite figure it out, but we don't come from Poland. But I identify with that sense of vulnerability, that very sacred sense of self, of seeking to preserve an endangered nation and notion of identity. I get it. I get it as a Jew. I'm not a Pole. I identify with it. And I feel in some sense, we can add Ukraine to the mix, but this is about Poland and the Jews. We should understand each other perhaps better than any other two peoples on the planet. That's my view. I'm sorry, you want to say something?
Yes, but I think that not many people among the Jewish community and in Israel think like you. Do you have more enemies or supporters in such a kind of a thinking?
Well, I never bothered to count before I began. And if I did, Eva, I think you know the answer because your question suggests the answer. Look, it's no secret to this room, and I've witnessed it again and again, because I've tried to take AJC in a very different direction, as you know, Eva, as you said. Our direction was not a popular direction in the American Jewish community. And it's no secret that I'm stepping down from my position at AJC after 32 years. And one of the things I'm actually very concerned about is who will be the voices of empathy and understanding of Poland in the American Jewish community. Yes. And I worry that instead we will face a kind of range from indifference, the sense of, why should I care about Poland? There are bigger countries and issues to think about than Poland, to outright hostility, which is a kind of inherited hostility. It's not an experienced response to Poland. It's by now a generationally inherited hostility that simply remembers, perhaps vaguely, my grandparents or great-grandparents had negative feelings about Poland. They thought Poland was an anti-Semitic country. They thought Poland was worse than this or that. That's it. That's the sum total of my knowledge of Poland. I myself have never been to Poland. I don't know Poles today, but that's part of the DNA that I inherited. And it stops there. And for many, it's also a moment of, if you will, convenience. Because the alternative route, which is the route that we at AJC took, entails risks. I don't mean physical threats, Eva, but it's much easier in the United States. I won't speak for Israel, but Yaakov Livne is here, but I do have some experience with the issue of Poland and Israel. You don't get popularity ratings in Israel for standing up as a dear friend of Poland. So, and by the way, I think, Eva, again, to be fair, you can also reverse the images and say, for some Poles, for some Polish politicians, for some Polish religious figures, it's quite the same. And we've seen this play out at various moments in time, which is why I think we all have to be careful about generalizing and creating a monolithic Israeli view or American Jewish view or Polish view. Take the books of Jan Gross. Is there unanimity in Poland about his books and his theses? Was there unanimity in Poland when President Kwasniewski traveled to Jedwabne. I think in fairness to all sides, we have to avoid a kind of sweeping generalization. There are American Jews, I happen to be one of them, who stood before, or sat before, Joe Biden when he was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and John Kerry when he was the senior ranking Democrat, who stood before them and said, admit Poland to NATO now. Not tomorrow, now. And when they asked, are you going to come back and advocate for the 3 Baltic states? Because that's really going to upset Moscow. The answer? Absolutely. Absolutely. Was that wildly popular? There was another Jewish organization at the time, Eva, a very prominent one, that took the opposite position and said, unless Poland does our bidding on restitution and indemnification, we will oppose and stop Poland's membership to NATO. That was the more popular position, the easier position to perhaps to defend, but it was the wrong position. By the way, as I would note parenthetically, as we now watch Turkey trying to transactionalize the proposed membership of Sweden and Finland to NATO, he's approaching it like a bazaar or a souk. There are certain issues, and we understood. This is an issue of the national security of Poland, as well as Hungary and the Czech Republic. There'll be a time for negotiation over communal property restitution and private property restitution, but to transactionalize a matter of the existential safety and security of Poland, we said no. Was it popular? No. Was it right? Yes.
David, we appreciate and we remember your role at that time when Poland was in the process of joining NATO, and I thank you very much for it.
There is no Jewish history without Poland. In my view, there is no Polish history without Jews. And the history itself, Eva, and again, I'm not a historian, but the history itself is not a one-dimensional history. Some of the great Jewish personalities, the great Jewish movements, the great Jewish ideas, the great Israeli leaders began their story here. Can you talk about Menachem Begin, for example? By removing the Polish story of the biography? Far from it. Begin was fully formed, fully educated, imprisoned, served in the military. We can't, like the Kremlin would do, we can't erase or Photoshop our two histories as if you didn't exist and we didn't exist. To the contrary. And there were good moments in that history, Eva. Just as there were painful moments, but there were good moments. Jews came here for a reason at the time. And the Polin Museum, this magnificent institution, which your former boss, Lech Kaczynski, when he was mayor, I remember our discussions with Lech Kaczynski and the gift of the land that began the creation of this museum. And by the way, Eva, and this is not to minimize the very painful aspects of Polish history, but I'm at a stage in my life where I have some understanding of Jewish history writ large. For more than 300 years, Jews were expelled from England. The word ghetto was not invented by Nazi Germany. It was invented in Venice and applied for centuries. I can go through every country in Europe, I repeat, every country in Europe, and talk about the painful aspects of Jewish history. Is there one country that escaped it? or avoided it. So to single out Poland relentlessly, obsessively, at the same time that we downplay or ignore the painful chapters of Jewish history elsewhere, I think is wrong. Now, some will respond, yes, David, but wait a second. Those countries have apologized in some way. Poland is still in the process of trying to align its sense of self as the Christ among the nations with the fact that some Poles did horrific things. Can the two coexist? I think many Poles have realized that the two can coexist. That except in a national mythology. And by the way, I've come to learn also that every nation, thinking about its own history, mixes fact with mythology. We mythologize some of our history to suit our own needs, and that's quite normal, whether in the United States or in Poland or elsewhere. We have a need for mythologizing, to elevate ourselves as societies, as peoples. But look, at the same time, in recent years, before these rounds of tension, 2018 to today, we have a reborn Jewish presence in Poland. Yes, it's small. I understand. There were 3.5 million Jews in Poland before the war, 10% of the population, 1/3 of Warsaw. Yes. But there's Jewish life being reborn in up to 10 cities. It's something. And it's being encouraged, it's being nurtured. Would I rather wear a kippah and walk across Warsaw in the middle of the night, or wear a kippah and walk across Paris in the middle of the night? I think the question answers itself today. Until recently, was Poland one of Israel's best friends, both bilaterally and multilaterally through the European Union, the Foreign Affairs Council? Absolutely. Did Poland step up earlier on when Israel needed a point of transit for Jews coming out of the Soviet Union in the late 80s to go directly to Israel? Yes, Poland stepped up. Is there intelligence cooperation, military cooperation? Absolutely. So my only point here, Eva, is it's much more complex. The balance sheet has two sides to it, multiple sides to it, as all nations do. So why focus exclusively on Poland, or especially on Poland to the exclusion of other countries?
David, I would like to ask you for advice. As you know, for the past week, there has been another escalation of tension between Poland and Israel. As you know, before the outbreak of pandemic, every year, at about 400,000 young Israelis were traveled to Poland to visit death and concentration camps, Nazi German former concentration camps in Poland, and to learn about the Holocaust and to honor those who were killed here during the Second World War. This summer, some 7,000 young people signed up for such a trip, but unfortunately they will not come. They will not come, and this is because this is the response of Israeli government to the Polish Foreign Ministry, who wanted to change the form of the status of the Israeli youth groups coming to Poland, and in specific, that was about the military, armed security that accompany the groups on their travel to Poland. What would be your advice, David? How to solve this problem?
It's always easier from the outside to solve the problem than the inside. So, look, number one, I don't think that I don't think that Poland is right to force the cancellation of these visits. And I don't think that Poland, which always did understand the need for security. It's not an abstract need. There's a real need for security. That suddenly they no longer understand that need for security. They understood it all along. And it clearly has disappointed thousands of young Israelis who made their plans, their families made their plans. I can't imagine it will boost the impression of Poland that they carry through their lifetime. But I will say this, at least from where I sit, I've tried over many years to talk to the March of the Living, for example, about something that I felt was wrong, obviously wrong. And that was to simply view Poland as a Jewish cemetery, and even to allow sometimes a kind of confusion about the cause of the cemetery. And by the way, I would add parenthetically that the idea that even today there are references in the American and other media about Polish death camps, to me is beyond comprehension. And of course, the worst example of this, unfortunately, involved Jan Karski posthumously. When President Obama read the citation, one of the proudest moments for everyone who knew Jan Karski and who worked for this, and we were among those who worked to convince the White House, and then the reference to Polish death camps. And by the way, to reveal again the paranoia among some, Eva, while many said this was a mistake, it was an innocent mistake, many others, including here, said, no, this was not an innocent mistake. This was absolutely intentional, and they wove a kind of conspiracy around the desire once again to assail and attack and stigmatize Poland. And probably in the minds of some of those here who believe this, there was a view that some Jews were inevitably involved. I spoke to a number of the people here. Richard, I'm sure you had your conversations, and perhaps others as well that I can't see from in the back of the room. I know Maciek is
here.
But I think you were in Washington before this event. We overlapped over NATO. I think you were there during NATO, yes. Right? So was it an innocent mistake on the part of President Obama and the White House, or was it a dark, devious conspiracy of those in the United States who wanted once again to point the finger at Poland with the worst three words that I think you can use in the English language today in reference to Poland? Polish death camps. I took one of our sons on the March of the Living in 1998. And I took him together with my niece and a couple of other of their peers. And before we left, I wrote them an essay, which they told me they read. I can't be sure. They were 16, in which I tried to put our visit to Auschwitz and Birkenau in a larger context, and also separate contemporary Poland from what we were about to see. Because I believe there are two stories that visitors, including young Israelis, should encounter. The first and obvious story, which we as Jews must see: Auschwitz, Birkenau, Majdanek, Belzec, Treblinka, Chełmno, Sobibor, the Warsaw Ghetto, the Łódź Ghetto, whatever is left, we need to see. And we don't have to apologize or explain why we need to see them. And we should understand, and our young people should understand, that what we're going to see were the crimes of Nazi Germany, the occupier of Poland, joined by accomplices from the Baltics, from Ukraine, from elsewhere, and yes, some Poles, in dispute, but some Poles. But the onus is on Nazi Germany. But how can I take 16-year-old impressionable children to Poland and tell them the story without at the same time showing them that there can be, I won't call them happy endings. There's no happy ending. But there can be new chapters of history written. Visit the synagogues, plural, in Warsaw. Meet the rabbis. Go to the Friday night service. Talk to the people. Hear their stories. One is more poignant and compelling than the next. Agnieszka, you know this very well. Stas, as a rabbi, you know this extremely well. Everyone who comes Friday night, Stas, to your synagogue, Etz Chaim, every single one has a story. A moving, powerful story. I wanted my children to hear those stories. And I think every Israeli child, if I may say so, should hear those stories. But no government can impose this on another government. No government can compel another government to adapt its curriculum. And yet, between friendly nations, these things, I think, can be worked out. I don't see any obstacle, Eva. I don't see any obstacle to thousands of Israelis coming here to understand the part of our national history, and yet at the same time engaging with young Poles today, if they're willing, if they're eager, and having a meal together, and playing a football match together, and having a dance together, and all those other things. They should.
That is exactly, David, what we were talking during the state visit of the late President Kaczynski in 2006 and 2008. There was even a mutual agreement signed at that time by the Tzipi Livni, the foreign minister of Israel. That was simply about to extend the visit of young people coming to Poland, extent of some knowledge about the history of Polish Jews, the heritage of the Jews on the Polish soil, but also the president wanted to extend further so the young Israeli could meet with the young Polish people, because otherwise those young Israeli are not coming to Poland. They are coming to
To a cemetery.
To the cemetery. The former ambassador of Israel, Shevak Weiss, said, to the Nazi German islands that are located in Poland. So, is there any solution? Can we meet halfway?
Yes, I mean, to me, Eva, there are obvious solutions. We were on the way to solutions. It's not as if nothing has changed in all these years. In my case, 41 years. A lot has changed. A lot has changed. But we know almost with a kind of certainty. They say on Wall Street, you can count every 10 years that there'll be a recession. So we know that every 5 years or 10 years, there will be an eruption. It will be the IPN law, it will be another law, it will be a statement by the Prime Minister of Israel. It will be something. Something will come along. And as far as we're concerned, Eva, in those moments, the bridge builders need to be ready to step in and manage the crisis management. Because if not, and now with social media even more rapidly, the arsonists step in. And instead of throwing buckets of water on the fire, they throw buckets of gasoline on the fire. I want to throw buckets of water on the fire. I want to build on what's been achieved. And a lot has been achieved, and we shouldn't lose sight of it. Again, I've said it before. The Polin Museum is one of the most magnificent institutions in the world when it comes to Jewish storytelling. It couldn't have happened without the participation of the city and the nation. It couldn't have happened. The rebirth of synagogues, the Krakow festivals, Belzhitz, you spoke about Belzhitz. Could Belzhitz have happened before 1989? Impossible. This is something I know well. We worked together with then President Kwasniewski, Prime Minister Leszek Miller. I know, like in America and Poland today, everything becomes immediately politicized. So you mention a politician, and the first instinct is he right, left, or center? And if I disagree with him on everything else, can I accept even this notion? I'm not here to be left, right, or center. What was accomplished at Belzhitz in this unusual partnership between the government of Poland and an NGO, American Jewish Committee, I think in many ways was unprecedented. For those of you who have not seen it, as we say in New York, it's a schlep to get there that served the Nazi purposes, presumably. But as the late Miles Lerman said, this may be the most memorialized and protected site of memory anywhere in Europe today. Anywhere in Europe. All of these things happened because we were moving forward, Eva. Yeah. We were moving forward. Now we have a situation, may I ask provocatively, and I was not asked, why is Yaakov Livni, yes, he's my friend, sitting here now in Warsaw for more than 4 months and has still not had the opportunity to present his credentials to become a fully functioning ambassador like every other ambassador, like my friend Lloyd Broderick of Australia? Why is he sitting here like this? And why, after more than 4 months, has a new Polish ambassador to replace Marek Magierowski not been announced? Are we playing political games here? What's the point of this? These are two, not just mature nations, these are two precious democracies. And Vladimir Putin, on February 24th, and before that in 2014 and 2008, should have reminded us there are bigger issues that unite us, even as he tries to divide us. So why? Why are thousands of Israeli children who had summer plans now being told you no longer have summer plans? This can be fixed with goodwill, Eva. This is not looking for a cure for pancreatic cancer. These are things that have solutions. Goodwill. The firemen, not the arsonists. They can find the solutions, but they have to be empowered to do so.
David, do you see many people who are ready to take a bucket of water during this
whole room, I
but I am asking you about the Jewish community and Israel. Do you see many people who think like you and who will be, willing to take this bucket of water and help?
I can't quantify, Eva, but I can tell you that just the Forum for Dialogue, which I mentioned earlier in AJC, have had an exchange program now for over 20 years. How many of you are alumni of the exchange program?
They're awesome, young, wonderful.
Look.
Bravo.
But there are hundreds in Poland and there are hundreds in the United States in the American Jewish community who are alumni of the program. And then Andrzej and his team have other programs. There are a lot of us who can be mobilized. Are there Israelis? Absolutely. Yaakov, you know better than I. But Israel has had one ambassador after another here, and their mandate, and some of them I knew very well, people like David Peleg was a very close personal friend, the late David Peleg. Mm-hmm. Their mandate was not to create chaos mm-hmm. or to generate trouble. Their mandate was to come and deepen and broaden and widen the bilateral relationship between Poland and Israel to the mutual benefit of both countries. That's the goal. That was their mandate. And Yaakov can speak for himself, of course, but that's his mandate. His mandate is not to come and bring gasoline and pour it. His mandate is, let's go forward. And let's find mechanisms for dealing with difficult issues that are collegial, purposeful, respectful, and that don't define the relationship every time they emerge. The United States has many difficult issues with our partners, including our closest allies. And most of them, thankfully, at least during most administrations, are dealt with the way they should be dealt with. Quietly, constructively, purposefully, because the glue that unites us is far more powerful than the issue du jour. So I'm looking at Lloyd, major issues that occurred between France and Australia. The United States was deeply involved. But look today, however difficult those issues were, they're now in the rearview mirror. Because France, the US, Australia, if I may say this, Lloyd, and please correct me, but at the end of the day, with all of the tension that was generated, the leaders never lost sight of the larger goal, which is we're allies. We're on the same side. So issues come up. Okay, issues come up. Issues come up in families. Issues come up in international relations. Manage them smartly. And keep your eye on the prize, the larger goal. We're allies. This is a dangerous world. We've been reminded of it. Poland has been reminding us of it. We, the Jewish people, and we, Poland, are natural allies, I believe. And that includes Israel and Poland as well, and it's been demonstrated since the late 1980s when relations were resumed.
David, you were absolutely unique, devoted to both sides in this dialogue and mutual understanding between Poles and Jews. I hope there is more like you in the world on both sides, on the three sides. Because you said that we have to look at the real world that we're living in. I have to ask one question that it's difficult for us to understand.
Only one.
Only one.
I'm glad everything else is clear.
Many people in Poland are disappointed that Israel does not call Russia's aggression against Ukraine by its name. We know the situation is very complicated, but Israelis understood the meaning of territorial integrity and have been defending it since the establishment of the State of Israel. David, how do you see it? Could you help us to understand?
Well, I can try, though there's someone in the room who's more equipped to explain than I, but I guess I'm the one with the microphone, so.
Yeah.
But Yaakov, if you feel differently, please, you'll take the microphone. Seriously. I think, as is too often the case in international affairs, you have here a clash of values and interests. And I think in many respects, Eva, it's quite unavoidable. Yeah. I think when it comes to values, the issues that are at stake, the principles worthy of defense, the rules-based international order, territorial integrity, sovereignty, I think there's no question among the Israelis I've met, and I've met those at the top who make decisions, there's no question that they understand fully the values that are at stake here. But they don't have the luxury, if you will, of ending the conversation there, Eva, because they have another reality, maybe two. The first reality was not of Israel's making. I would say quite honestly, very honestly, that it was the making of a previous American administration. that spoke very clearly about a red line for Syria and for President Assad if he used chemical weapons. And indeed, he used chemical weapons. He used nerve agents. An estimated 1,400 people were killed by those nerve agents just in one period. And that should have triggered the American response because the red line was crossed. And I still remember the day, it was a Friday, and the world was watching the White House. And even though England and Germany were opposed to any use of force against Syria, France, then led by President François Hollande, was ready to join with the United States. And their Air Force planes were ready. They were ready. And then came the word from the White House. No, we believe this has to go to the US Congress. And effectively, that was the end of the discussion. It was going to be tied up there, Eva, for a very long time. And what did that mean? It meant two things above all. And we said it that day, that Friday. Number one, Russia now had an open invitation into Syria. And two, all of this public talk about Assad must go as a consequence of the Syrian civil war. If there's to be a solution, Assad must go. How many thousands of times did we hear that expression? Became Assad will stay. So Russia entered Syria, Assad stayed, and not only did Assad stay, but who were his closest partners? Iran and Hezbollah. Israel faces an existential challenge in Syria because of the Russian presence there and because of the Russian control of the airspace over Syria. And if Israel is to deal successfully with the Iranian effort to militarize further Syria and Hezbollah's efforts to support this, its hands are tied unless it has some kind of understanding with Russia. It's not by desire, it's not the choice, it's the only option. So even if there can be a legitimate debate, and I'm not excluding a legitimate debate, could Israel move another 5 yards in this direction or 10 yards in this direction? I think those who will not even acknowledge the difficult set of choices that Israel faces are not being fair in this process. They have another agenda at work. Because not to even acknowledge this as a real issue faced by Israel, an existential issue, I think is to ignore the obvious, Eva. Once that's established, sure, you even see within Israel a kind of nuanced debate about how far Israel might go. Could it go a little further? The Israeli field hospital in western Ukraine, the Israeli humanitarian assistance, the non-lethal military assistance, the votes in the UN General Assembly are all kind of pointing Israel in a direction. But if Russia stops the kind of, what shall I call it? It's not cooperation, it's more the wink and the nod to Israeli actions over Syrian airspace, big trouble. And the second issue, which is again a very tricky issue, is the Jewish community in Russia. Again, we can debate it. We have this issue at AJC regarding the Jewish community in Iran, the Jewish community in Turkey, those Jews who had a chance to leave and never left, and what responsibility do we have for them versus our other responsibilities to other principles and values at stake. Until now, strangely, there are those who believe that Putin, for some reason, is a philo-Semite. Masha Gessen has written about this in her book, The Man Without a Face. By now, we've all heard the stories, Eva, about the religious Jewish couple that lived in the same communal apartment and that often served as a kind of surrogate home for young Volodya. We heard about his teacher of German for whom he bought a house in Israel, reportedly. But I would say, and we saw it with Lavrov's comments, Hitler was a Jew, or essentially words to that effect. Can anyone seriously trust Putin, even if his first instinct might have been philo-Semitism, whatever that means? I think that would be an insane policy. Putin will turn on a dime or a kopeck. Lavrov already did. Putin pulled him back. Maybe it was orchestrated, maybe it was not. I don't pretend to know. But what happens to those Jews? Again, I want to stress, Eva, I don't think it can be the only consideration, but it has to be one of the considerations for Jerusalem here. So my only point is, it's not so simple. There are values which are clear and defended. There are interests which are difficult and unavoidable. You have a clash, and that's where the debate is. And by the way, just one final word I can't resist, but there are other countries which have less obvious reasons for sitting on the fence.
That's right.
If I may put it that way. You know, Poland always believes, and this is another thing we have in common, Poland always believes that the press is harsher on Poland than other countries, treats Poland by a different standard. Well, I have news for you. The Jews feel the same way. Israelis and friends of Israel, we feel exactly the same way. So look around the Middle East to begin with. Look at all the countries sitting on the fence. And look at the countries that congratulated Russia on Russia Day, Din Rasi. Several of Israel's neighbors were among those countries. Look at the foreign policy of India today, and I can keep going. And I'm not saying this to somehow harshly criticize them. Each has its own reasons. I wish they didn't have those reasons, but their reasons are less obvious to me than Israel's reasons, which are very obvious to me.
Thank you, David, for this explanation. I think that there are many people here who would like to ask you some questions, and we have to give
I was
them
hoping I could
time
avoid
for
that.
it. Yes, but before we let you ask your questions, maybe we comment. I would ask you for the optimistic, maybe not necessarily, but the comments at the end. What we could expect in a coming year, especially when next year we will commemorate the 80th anniversary of a Warsaw Ghetto, which always unites Jewish people from all over the world with Poles and with Israeli.
Well, I used to collect jokes, humor from the Soviet Union, from the Soviet days, and one of the jokes, in inverted commas, was, and there were, by the way, many variations of this. You'll know some of them. What's the definition of an optimist in the Soviet Union? And the answer is someone who was insufficiently pessimistic. Another answer is a person without all the facts. So maybe I'm insufficiently pessimistic, and maybe I don't have all the facts, Eva. So forgive me. I think there's an optimistic scenario, and I don't just think it's a Hollywood-driven, we have to have a happy ending story. Again, we had a taste of the happy story. We saw it. It wasn't just an abstraction or an illusion or a dream. We saw it for much of the period from 1988, 89 until the present. Imperfect, of course. We're not going to agree on every moment in history. We're not going to agree on exactly what the blue police did and did not do. We're not going to agree on the number of Poles who were involved in the killing of Jews, even as the Poles themselves were the targets of Nazi Germany. We're not going to fully agree, but we managed. We managed those issues within a larger context, I think, of an excitement that I felt in Poland, that one way of getting rid of the legacy of Sovietism, of Bolshevism, of communism, is to do the exact opposite. If Jews were oppressed, we're going to welcome the resurgence of Jewish life. If relations were cut off between us and Israel, we're going to restore the relations. If Poland was a haven like East Germany and Czechoslovakia and others for anti-Israel terrorist groups to operate, to hide, to train, to be funded, we're going to do the opposite. We're going to stand with Israel. We're going to vote with Israel. We're going to welcome Israelis here. We're going to put up signs in our airport, Baruchim Habaim. We're going to go for visa-free regimes and do double taxation agreements and normalize our relations, because part of us, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, part of us is in Israel. And part of Israel and the Jewish people is here, and it's time for us to unbury this. So we saw it, Eva. It's doable. What does it take? More than anything, like so much in our world, is enlightened leadership. Enlightened leadership. Leadership that doesn't lead by following. Leadership that leads by leading. And leading means even taking some risks.
David, I hope that even that you said that you are stepping out of as a executive director of...
By the way, for the record, I don't think it's anything I said about Israel.
Yes, neither do I.
but Yaakov, like Lloyd, the Australian ambassador, alerted me in advance that they have other meetings to go to. Or was it me?
Or was it me?
Thank you very much. I really have to go.
Of course.
Thank you for everything that you have been doing. And it will
I just want to be sure for the record. It's doable. It's doable.
But we need leaders like you, David,
Well,
on both sides.
We need leaders in Jerusalem. We need leaders in Warsaw. We
In
need
New York.
leaders who see the big picture. And I use the word courage, but courage, I mean, compared to what Ukraine is showing now, this is what courage is required here? This much. I mean, compared to what President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people are doing today, we would say in Yiddish, this is bupkis.
Mm-hmm.
This is minuscule. But we need political leaders who lead. And unfortunately, in our world today, and not just on this issue, Eva, I fear we have very few strong political leaders.
Yeah.
In the democratic world. Unfortunately, in the non-democratic world, we have too many. Please. And I hope everyone knows Aldona, who works in the AJC office. And
David, I'm really astonished by your deep commitment to good Polish-Jewish relationship, not only as alumni of exchange program, but especially as a Polish Jew and Polish citizen. But I have to sorry, but I have to disagree with one. I have to disagree with one sentence you said.
good, okay.
So, and I think I have to. You said that there is no Polish history without Jews. There is. There is one place where is Polish history without Jews. The place is the new curriculum of new Polish course in secondary school. The name of this course is History and Now. Do you think that there is word Jews when it's about 1968? No. This course is about history after Second World War, but the name is History and Now. So I'm very. It's a real problem if you are talking about future of Polish-Jewish relationship, because we are talking about obligatory course in all Polish secondary school. And it's also important for me personally. I have daughter in secondary school, as well as I'm publisher of historical textbooks. So I understand the problem really, really deep. So if you are talking about future, I think I don't want to blame Polish Minister of Education only. I know that the Israeli Ministry of Education have something which, if you are talking, for instance, about March of the Living. So I know, but I'm Polish citizen, I have children in Polish school, so.
We don't disagree in the sense that my statement was, I think factually correct. There is no Polish history without Jews, and there is no Jewish history without Poland. What you point to is a huge issue which I need to become more aware of and understand how best to address. Because if this is the direction it's going, then it makes our job even more difficult, obviously, not to mention the challenge for you as a father of a child in the school system. And I think the gentleman in the back, is it?
Yes.
Yes, please.
Jarek Pyjak. I have two short questions about the lack of enlightened leadership, as you called it. One is the comparison you have made about the issues in relations in the Western Europe and in Poland. Would you agree with the conclusion that the issues in the Western Europe are more of a character of being a collateral damage caused by the Middle Eastern events and especially Israeli-Palestinian relationships, while in Poland the root cause, especially now, is the loss of collective memory, which have been enacted by the Polish parliament, and putting at the forefront the national truth, quote unquote, or the national suffering. And as Emir Bartov used to say, the laws of collective memory are for what to remember and what is to be forgotten. And this is that thing. And another question is on Israel's stance versus the Russian aggression. You have portrayed the interest of Israel in the triangle between Syria, Hezbollah, Russia, and Israel. And Iran. But there is no United States in your equation, which is the largest ally of Israel. And I want to compare this situation with Lithuania, one of the smallest European countries, dared to challenge Putin 2 days ago, and they stopped the transit to Kaliningrad. They have jeopardized their interests to the utmost degree. They have been threatened with the harshest words by Putin and his henchmen, and yet they rely on the United States and they rely on the allied purpose, so they did it. And the question is, could Israel become Lithuania in this situation?
Yeah, sir, can you keep the microphone? Aldona, could you give it back? Could I come back to your first question and ask you, I wasn't sure about when you referred to Western Europe and the Israeli-Palestinian issue.
You were saying that...
Could you explain that one?
You were simply saying, you made a short remark that wearing a kippah in Paris at night would not make you feel as secure at wearing kippah in Poland. So I believe that the resentments you may meet at the Paris streets is the Arab immigrants, and for that sake they are not involved in the history of the World War II. they look at the present situation.
Yeah. Well, I'll work backwards. Like you, I'm a big admirer of Lithuania. In fact, with Jillian Laskowitz, who's here somewhere. Jillian, are you here? Yeah. We were in Vilnius a month ago, and we had the opportunity to meet with the President and the Prime Minister and the Speaker of the Parliament. And we had met separately with Foreign Minister Landsbergis when he came to New York. I have great admiration for Lithuania, and I'll say joked, but it's not a joke, obviously. You know, Lithuania feels so strong that it not only challenged Russia, as you mentioned, but you know, that's on Monday and Thursday, and on Tuesday and Friday it challenges China with its own policy on Taiwan. And the word values is in every second sentence in Vilnius when you meet with the government. So I can't compare Lithuania and Israel directly. I can say that Lithuania is covered by Article 5. Israel is not. There is no bilateral treaty between the United States and Israel. There are lots and lots of agreements and understandings. I don't want to mislead. But Israel is not a member of NATO. There is no Article 5, and there is no treaty obligation the way the United States has with Japan or South Korea, for example. There is no treaty obligation. And from the Israeli perspective, and here I'm speculating, of course the United States is its most important ally. But the last thing in the world the United States needs now is one more front. I think that's pretty clear in Washington. You have the Ukraine front, even as the United States was pivoting towards Asia and believing that this would be the new sort of theater, so to speak. So I think Israel understands, and it has for quite some time, that with all of its friendship with the United States, at the end of the day, Israel's on its own. And I would add one more thing. After the withdrawal from Afghanistan, even more so. And not just Israel. I think the long shadow of the nature of the American withdrawal from Afghanistan has shaken a lot of countries. It seems long ago, it was only August, so it's what, 10 months ago, but it's still there. On the enlightened leadership, again, I'm sure it's me. I'm not sure I quite got the point that you were making. Yes, I think it's true, by the way. Stas, I don't know if you would agree with me that you're safer wearing a kippah at night in Warsaw or in this part of Europe than in Brussels or Paris or Marseille or Antwerp. I think there's no question. I think the danger in those places comes from two main sources. One is the far right, and the other is within the Muslim immigration. I want to distinguish not the Muslim immigration, but within it. Within it. And strangely, tragically, these two movements feed off each other. The more Muslim migration, the more the far right feels it has a case to make. And by the way, we saw the French parliamentary results. In some respects, they're frightening. I mean, France is a mature democracy. France is the home of the rights of man. The French Revolution, that nearly 50% of French voters voted for the far left or the far right, I think should worry us all. And that brings brings up larger questions about the strength of liberal democratic societies, and whether these societies are still capable and willing to defend themselves in their core values. So I think there's a lot going on here. And more generally, I have to say that, I say this with some sadness, there are not many world leaders today in the democratic space who I think are up to the task. And perhaps ironically, a young Jewish actor, comedian, with no previous political experience, thrust into a job which he won quite decisively, but when there was no war, may have become the most enlightened and inspiring political leader of our time. And of course I speak about Volodymyr Zelensky. Beyond that, it's hard to see. I don't know if we have time for one more question, Aldona.
David, do you think the Polish government is essentially right in its criticism of Israeli mass tourism to Poland, both in terms of security and curriculum?
Do I think, coming from Kostik, there's more to the question than those few words. Is it right? As I said, Kostik, again, from what I know, and I'm not involved with the Shin Bet, I mean, with the Israeli sort of security services in their assessment. But if it's their assessment that these groups continue to need armed protection, then I for one would not question or dispute it. Nor, as I understand it, Kostik did the polls until now. And by the way, I should tell you, last September, Foreign Minister Rao came for the UN General Assembly. And that was at the height of the tension after the last parliamentary law on statute of limitations on property claims. And he came, and it was as far as diplomatic meetings go, he came to the AJC building. It was a fairly, what shall I call it, correct meeting. He told us that if this continues, you will see a change in Poland's policy in Brussels on voting respecting Israel, and you will see a review of Poland's policy of permitting armed Israeli guards to accompany Israeli youth groups. He told us that last September. If this continues, and the focus of his anger, fairly or unfairly, Kostik, as you know, was Yair Lapid. It was very personalized. It wasn't Israel per se. It was Yair Lapid. But because Yair Lapid was foreign minister and destined to become the prime minister, which, not this way, but this way is the way it's turning out. This was not a voice that one could easily dismiss. And Naftali Bennett, the prime minister, did not distance himself from Yair Lapid's comments. That's the nature of their arrangement and the government coalition. And I cannot speak to Naftali Bennett's own thinking on Poland. I've never had a discussion with Naftali Bennett about Poland, to be honest with you. I have with Yair Lapid, more than one. And all of this comes from his father, I think it's fair to say. This was the way Tomi Lapid, born in Novi Sad in Serbia, this was the way he saw the world and experienced the world as a Jew during the Shoah and then as a survivor. And Yair, I think, wants to honor the memory of his father and those like his father, and this is the way he's interpreted it. So I defer to the Israelis on this one. I have no basis for my own opinion other than Kishka, impulse, and Kishka doesn't work in the real world of international relations. The Israeli curriculum. Well, as I said, if we're up to me, the curriculum would look quite different. The problem, I think, becomes when it evolves into a diplomatic face-off. You know, once it's in the public sphere and you have two, in this case, grown men, or facing off against each other, then no one wants to be seen as the weaker, the one who backs off, the one who apologizes. And that's why I believe that these issues need to be taken out of the public space and put back in the private space, in those rooms where we're not sitting and we don't read about it the next day in Polish or American or Israeli newspapers. When it's in the public space, I mean, okay, Chancellor Scholz, I'm sorry, President Steinmeier apologized. Am I right? I think on February 27th or thereabouts, am I right? I mean, that's maybe once in a century, you know, that a leader will actually apologize and say, if as a Jew I can say, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa, which one doesn't hear from Jews very often, I have to note. It doesn't happen, but this is when I think, again, these issues have to be brought back behind closed doors and onto tables where thoughtful, well-intentioned, constructive people want to find solutions. The solutions exist. I guarantee you, if you were sitting in the room, you could offer solutions. I have the chutzpah to say that I could offer solutions. But you and I are not in the room. So when will the wiser heads prevail? And now, with Israeli elections, again,
Yeah.
you know, from the Israeli side, are wiser heads going to prevail in the next few months? I'm not sure. Is it to the advantage of Israelis to now bring up this issue? Probably not. Do Polish leaders care enough to bring it up themselves? I'd like to think so. I'm not sure. And then there's a wild card. It actually goes back to the gentleman in between you. The United States. Mm-hmm. From our conversations with, as they say, top officials in Washington, some of them are not happy about the state of affairs between Poland and Israel. They're not happy. By the way, they're not happy about the ongoing fights between Seoul and Tokyo. Again, all rooted in history, nothing to do with tariffs or trade or territories or intellectual property, all rooted in history. And the U.S. is saying to both Seoul and Tokyo, boys, and they tend to be boys or men, enough, enough. There are bigger issues in the world right now. There's the future of the Korean Peninsula. There's the future of China. There's the future of the region. You are both allies of the United States. And instead of exchanging intelligence and cooperating fully at every level, you're relying on Washington as the filter. So Tokyo goes to Washington, Washington shares with Seoul, Seoul goes to Washington, Washington shares with... No, those days are over, Mr. Biden has said. And the same thing here. Poland and Israel, you're both key allies of the United States. Key allies of the United States. Essential allies of the United States. So stop this already. Stop this. There are solutions. There are solutions. And if you need the help of Tony Blinken or Wendy Sherman or Victoria Nuland or Jake Sullivan, we'll make them available to you. But frankly, you shouldn't even need them. But it's in the interest of the United States that you, Poland and Israel, stop this nonsense. And will that happen? Is it happening? I think there's already some concern in Washington. I've heard it with my own ears from, as they say, Richard Schnepp can interpret if you need to, from the 7th floor of the State Department. That's the key floor. You know that as well, right? That's the key floor.
Yeah.
Not the 6th, not the 8th, the 7th floor. So that may be the wild card here, Kostik. And I don't think that that's an unlikely or improbable scenario. To the contrary. Enough. Sebastian says one last question. Aldona, if there is one.
Just
Yes,
me.
there is.
Just you.
Oh, that's Rabbi Shudri.
Michael, I couldn't even see you back there.
That's why I'm sitting here. I always dream about sitting in the back of the synagogue, and I can't. At least at your lecture, I could sit in the back.
You know, but there are extra points in heaven for the people sitting in the front.
Who told you that? Sitting in the front, yeah. So anyway, I have lots of questions, even more comments. I'm not going to ask them.
sure
I'm not going to tell them. But I just speak in my own name, and I believe in the name of everyone here, to say thank you. We first met in the 1980s.
Speaking of Tokyo,
Yes.
a fun fact, does everyone know that Michael
Yes.
Shudrik was the chief, he was the only rabbi and the chief rabbi of Japan.
Was I like to, people used to refer to me as the chief rabbi of Japan, I would say, remember, I'm also the bottom rabbi. But the amount that I have personally learned from you, whether it was through our day symposium on the problem of anti-Semitic literature in Japan in 1980, 1988, 9, through the work in Poland, whether it was Belgians and many other subjects. I just simply want to say thank you very much.
And I would only add that, David, thank you for your understanding, sometimes sacrifice, courage, and leadership. Thank you, David. It was a privilege, and it is a privilege to know you. Thanks.
And thank you to the spirit of, as long as there was a Jan Karski, there will be a purpose to this conversation and a potential way forward. I believe that. That's not a throwaway line for Eva and her work. People like you are inspired by Karski, and people like me inspired by Karski. Our water in our buckets must always be more than the gasoline in their buckets. That's it.
One final note. I'm not sure we got a clear answer from you, David, to the question, is there a future for Polish-Jewish relations? And I would like to use two quotes from what you have said during this conversation. As I read it, as I understood it, your answer was a conditional yes. It's not an easy yes, it's a conditional yes. There is a future for Polish-Jewish relations only if we follow two of your instructions, or if we follow two sources of motivation. One is a positive one, and the other is negative. The positive one is, so much has been achieved. If it would be unwise, it would be silly not to continue that, not to follow up on that. The negative would be, if we stop working together, there is only one person on this planet who would see this as a benefit, and that person is Vladimir Putin. So thank you so much, David, for your insight and painting the picture with so many colors. And I guess we all are getting inspiration from what you have said. There's a lot of work that is needed, and Poland and Israel stop this nonsense. Thank you.
So my headline here is, don't allow ourselves to become prisoners of history. We must always be students of history, but strive to be authors of history. And that's what we're striving at AJC in our own modest way, it's too easy to become prisoners of history. Too easy to carry on that generational hostility that Polish Catholics may inherit in their homes and Jews of Polish background inherit in their homes. It's too easy. But we can become authors of history and shared history, shared protection of democracy, shared protection of human dignity, shared protection of the history, of the integrity of history. Look, Poland deserves bonus points for having warned Europe for years, take Russia seriously. And much of Europe did not want to take Russia seriously. You were right. You were right. And why were you right? Because you didn't simply study history at Jagiellonian University or Warsaw University. You lived history on the front line. Guess who else lived history on the front line? Guess who else understands as well as you do what Putin's denazification really means? We have a lot of work to do together. A lot. There's an agenda. There's a way forward. But leaders have to lead. And we have to make sure the leaders know that we expect them to lead. That's it. And then we get going. And we saw what we could achieve from 1989 forward, what you could achieve. There's more to be done. It can be done. And AJC is here in Warsaw with an office precisely not just to talk blah, 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 but to do what we can to support these efforts.
Last sentence, Sebastian. As you know, on Friday, the Jewish culture in Krakow's Kazimierz starts for the 31st time. This is the results of our mutual work, of your work. And you know what? 1/3 of the guests are coming from Israel. Right. And one of the main partners, Janusz Maków, the organizer of the festival, is the organization Hamifal. This is the organization from Jerusalem. So maybe you see each other there on Szeroka Street at the last final concerts, where sometimes 10,000, sometimes 20,000, sometimes 30,000 people from all over the world are holding hands and dancing. And this year it will be 60 volunteers coming from over 20 countries. David, you wouldn't believe, from India, from Pakistan. Can you imagine? Yes. But they are coming. And they are not Jewish. They will be there.
From Pakistan, I'm pretty sure.
But also from Chile. They are also coming from Chile. Yeah.
Possible.
They will be learning they will be learning the history. They will be learning the history of Jews and the history of Polish Jews and the history of Poland there. So see you there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you, Ewa. Thank you, everyone, for coming. You can watch again, or you can share the link with your friends. This conversation was live streamed and is available on YouTube, AJC Central Europe. And you can also watch today's Fakty po faktach. You will not regret it.